but basically HES been my producer, and HES inspired me so much. The interviewer leans in. What has been his influence in the musical world? There's a pause. For me, or just in the musical world? Stevie Wonder asks, almost amused. He drifts into a memory. I used to think when I'd hear the rain and smell the rain in the air, the moss, the way it hangs, it made me think of cornflakes. Stevie Wonder has spent his life speaking about love, justice, and accountability. But according to people who watched his choices closely, there are names he never defended, legends he never protected, men he quietly allowed to fall out of his circle in black music culture. That kind of silence is not simple politeness. It functions like a verdict. Behind the smiling photographs, the heartfelt tributes, and the carefully edited documentaries, there are files most fans have never really seen, masks that never slipped under the stage lights, power exercised in hotel rooms, studios, and offices, harm politely explained away as artistic genius, and moments so dark that even Stevie Wonder, a man known for empathy, chose distance over loyalty. This is not a story about bad tempers, ego clashes, or creative disagreements. It is about conduct that crossed a line into something harsher, something that brushes up against the word evil. In this documentary, we open the record on 10 black music legends whose public images, according to reports and testimonies, hid actions the industry tried to quietly bury with dates, cities, witnesses, and consequences attached. Because sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not the ones we were warned about. They are the ones we were taught to celebrate. 1. James Brown, when violence became the definition of leadership. By the late 1980s, James Brown was no longer just a figure who intimidated critics or worried police departments. According to former band members and staff, he was feared inside his own circle. Musicians, road crew, long minus time associates all learned to scan his posture, his tone, the temperature of the room, watching for the moment when rehearsal could turn into danger. In James Brown's universe, discipline no longer meant tight arrangements or musical precision. It meant obedience. On April 4, 1988, that private fear broke the surface in Augusta, Georgia. What started, according to official reports, as a disturbance call at Brown's office spiraled into something that felt almost unreal. Witnesses said he was armed, suspicious, and visibly unstable as he climbed into his pickup truck and fled, triggering a multi-minus city police chase that cut across county lines. At one point, officers reported Brown had crossed into South Carolina. At another, they radioed in that shots had been fired. This was not a simple misunderstanding or a bad day. It was a breakdown happening in real time, carried across police frequencies and later examined under cold courtroom lights. Among former band members, one story from the late 1970s still circulates quietly. It was an afternoon rehearsal before a Southern tour date. Brown halted the band mid-minus song not because the groove was off, but because the drummer had come in half a beat late. He walked slowly across the room, staring without speaking, then announced the punishment of $50 cash fine, paid immediately, no discussion. When the drummer tried to explain, Brown cut him off with a command that musicians remember word for word, don't talk. Play. That night on stage, the pressure escalated. Brown deliberately stretched the routine, forcing the group through extra breakdowns and sharp transitions. When a horn player misstepped on choreography, Brown snapped his fingers toward the wings. Security entered, expressionless. The musician was escorted off the stage in front of a paying audience and replaced without warning at the next show. Backstage, no one argued. No one demanded an explanation. They packed their instruments in heavy silence. One musician would later say that the true fear wasn't losing the job, it was being humiliated, blacklisted, or confronted physically. Everyone, according to insiders, knew James Brown kept weapons around. Everyone also pretended not to know. This was leadership by terror. Skill meant nothing if you spoke up. Loyalty meant nothing if you hesitated. The only real protection was silence. And once silence becomes the standard, abuse stops feeling shocking. It becomes part of the routine. What made the 1988 incident different is that the violence could no longer be framed as genius under pressure. Guns were involved. Law enforcement was involved. Innocent people were endangered. Something shifted among his peers. Around this period, those close to both men said Stevie Wonder began to step back. There was no press conference, no angry statement. But observers noticed what went missing. Public praise faded. Proposed collaborations quietly disappeared. Invitations were declined. People who moved in both circles claimed Stevie refused to dress up what he saw as cruelty masquerading as leadership. For Stevie, music could be exhausting, demanding, relentless, but it was never supposed to be enforced with fear. The contrast between the two men mattered. James Brown, by many accounts, believed fear kept musicians sharp and obedient. Stevie Wonder believed fear suffocated the soul of creativity. When Brown's behavior, already harsh and private, crossed into open violence, Stevie reportedly chose distance over loyalty. The legal fallout came quickly. Brown was arrested, charged, and eventually sentenced to prison time. His legend remained. His records stayed on the radio. The choreography, the horn stabs, the scream, all of it survived untouched. But the incident forced fans to look at something they had rarely been asked to examine honestly. This was not a man simply losing it for a brief moment. It was a long minus-term pattern dragged into daylight, stripped of stage lights and applause. Why do some people describe this as evil? Not because James Brown was imperfect, most artists are. Not because he struggled with paranoia or substance issues, many do. But because he allegedly used his position to intimidate, carried weapons to reinforce control, and turned public humiliation into a standard management technique. He understood the fear he caused. He depended on it. And when even Stevie Wonder, an artist widely seen as forgiving and hopeful, refused to normalize that behavior, the message landed hard. Genius does not excuse terror. Leadership does not require violence. And some legends, no matter how influential, lose the right to be defended the moment fear becomes their primary instrument. 2. Marvin Gaye. When a family slowly came apart and nobody stopped it. It did not begin with a gunshot. It began with doors slamming, voices rising, and the same Los Angeles address appearing in police logs again and again. From January through March 1984, neighbors watched patrol cars pull up, officers walk inside, calm things down, and then leave. Each time the street went quiet. Each time, according to those inside the house, the pressure only tightened. Marvin Gaye was not hiding his collapse. Friends said his mood swung like a broken pendulum, soft, apologetic, almost fragile, one moment furious, suspicious, and impossible to reach the next. He barely slept. He argued constantly. He spoke as if unnamed enemies were closing in. Family members later said the home did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap they could not step out of. Everyone knew something terrible was forming on the horizon. No one could find the lever to switch its direction. Behind the scenes, through quiet industry channels, Stevie Wonder tried to change the outcome. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't give interviews. Instead, he reached out to people who still had access to Marvin. According to those who heard about these conversations, his message was painfully simple: get him out of that house. Get him help. Do not wait for the next explosion. But waiting is exactly what happened. Marvin refused doctors. He refused treatment. He refused to leave his parents' home, even as the arguments with his father became more intense, more physical, more frightening. The people around him were paralyzed by history, by loyalty, and by fear of pushing too hard. The music industry, as usual, stayed hands-off. Everyone hoped the storm would somehow pass on its own. On April 1, 1984, it didn't. A family argument escalated past the point of retreat. Words turned into a physical struggle. A gun that Marvin himself had reportedly purchased months earlier came into play. In the chaos that followed, his father pulled the trigger. Marvin Gaye was gone at 40-4. What makes this story unbearable is not just the violence of the final moment. It is how avoidable it feels when you retrace the steps. The warning signs were not hidden. They were written down: repeated police visits, shaken relatives, a man unraveling in plain sight. And still, Marvin chose to remain inside the very pressure cooker he had helped build. Calling this evil makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't resemble deliberate cruelty. There is no mastermind plan to hurt others. Instead, it looks like a series of refusals. Refusal to step away from a dangerous environment. Refusal to acknowledge that he had become a threat to the peace of his own home. Refusal to protect the people closest to him when he knew his temper and paranoia were spiraling. His genius did not kill him. His unwillingness to stop did. For Stevie Wonder, that distinction mattered. He could feel compassion for Marvin's vulnerability, for the pressure of fame, for the internal war that never quieted. But according to those close to him, Stevie drew a hard line. Vulnerability might explain the pain, yet it did not erase the damage left behind for family, neighbors, and fans to carry. 3. Berry Gordy. When careers were engineered through favoritism. By the summer of 1967, the Motown headquarters in Detroit felt less like a label and more like a high-speed factory, always buzzed with secretaries and songwriters. Studio doors opened and closed on strict schedules. Hit singles were mapped out on whiteboards. Television appearances were plotted months ahead. Careers were assembled in closed-door meetings where only a few people ever knew the full plan. On the surface, it looked like a miracle of black success. Underneath, according to insiders, it was a system of careful selection. Berry Gordy had already chosen who would carry the Motown banner into the future. Diana Ross was positioned everywhere: prime-time television slots, film discussions, magazine covers, front-center marketing campaigns. At the very same time, other black female vocalists, some with equal or even greater rap on stage, were quietly slowed down. Release dates drifted. Promised singles never hit radio. Tours were reduced or rerouted. One of the most affected, according to reports from within Motown, was Gladys Knight. She could level a room in seconds. Audiences rose to their feet before the last note. Yet her momentum seemed strangely stalled. Not canceled, not pushed forward, just held in a kind of professional limbo. Those who were close to the decision-making called it strategy. Gordy allegedly did not want two dominant female stars competing for the same spotlight at the same time. One queen at the front, they said. Everyone else became insurance talented enough to use when needed, easy to push aside when they threatened the hierarchy. Watching all of this unfold left a deep impression on a young Stevie Wonder. He saw talent treated like a bargaining chip. He watched artists who did everything right wait quietly for a moment that never arrived. He saw how often patience was rewarded not with opportunity, but with silence. So while he still had leverage, Stevie made a different move. He negotiated for creative control, for the right to shape his own sound, for ownership of his future work. He refused to trust that the system would eventually do right by him just because he was loyal. To him, Motown's unwritten rules were clear. The machine did not always reward brilliance. It rewarded obedience. Artists who questioned release schedules or challenged business choices were branded difficult. Those who kept quiet were repeatedly told, "Your time is coming." For many of them, that time never arrived. Years slipped away. Prime creative windows were lost, not because the talent wasn't there, but because the gatekeeper had made different choices. What makes this story so unsettling is how clean it all looked from the outside. There were no cops at the door, no public bloopers, no tabloid headlines. Careers were slowed down legally, politely, and in some cases permanently. Lives were altered with the stroke of a pen, the moving of a date, the quiet shelving of a song. Berry Gordy knew who had the gift. According to former staff and artists, he simply decided who would rise fastest and who would be kept in the shadows, and the consequences stretched over decades. Stevie Wonder never forgot those early lessons. For him, control that crushes potential isn't just business. When it targets the very people who built the sound, it starts to look like betrayal. For Ike Turner, when violence stopped being an incident and became the routine. At 2 o'clock, on July 1, 1976, The elevator doors of a Dallas hotel opened and a single figure stepped out. It was Tina Turner. She was alone. Her face was swollen. One eye was barely open. She was still wearing the same stage clothes she had been in when the argument started hours earlier. No luggage. No entourage. Just a woman walking through a silent lobby, crossing an invisible line she knew could cost her everything. She left the hotel and walked across a highway toward nearby Ramada Inn. The night traffic roared past. When she reached the front desk, the clerk looked up, saw her condition, and chose not to ask questions. Tina paid for the room with 30 minus 6 cents and a nearly maxed minus out credit card. Inside that small, anonymous space, she finally stopped moving. She had fled Ike Turner. This was not a sudden, impulsive escape. It was the last chapter of a pattern the music world had quietly lived with for years. Backstage arguments were common. Rehearsals were broken by shouting behind closed doors. Musicians exchanged looks and turned up their instruments, pretending not to hear. Ike Turner's violence, according to band members and crew, was not a secret. It was managed, repackaged as temper, reframed as the pressure of genius. Crew members later admitted they knew exactly when to clear out of a room. Promoters learned that stepping in could mean losing their contract. Doctors treated injuries and accepted vague explanations. Everyone who depended on the Ike-Tina Turner machine understood one rule like rule through fear, and fear kept the show on the road. What made July 1 different was that Tina did not go back. The cycle snapped. When the story finally reached the public, the industry split in uncomfortable directions. Some rushed to soften Ike's image, talking about addiction, stress, the difficulties of marriage. Others chose the safer option, silence. No comments, no statements, just distance. Stevie Wonder made a different choice. He did not defend Ike Turner. He did not appear on camera to talk about both sides. He did not help reframe the abuse as mutual relationship problems, even though at that time many artists closed drinks and protected each other no matter what. Stevie's refusal to participate in that protection became its own kind of statement. Why did it matter so much? Because Ike's violence wasn't random. It was repeated, intentional, and reinforced by everyone who looked away. He knew exactly how much power he had. He relied on the silence around him to keep using it. For years, the abuse continued in dressing rooms, hotel suites, and tour buses, while audiences clapped for the chemistry they saw on stage. Ike Turner was not exposed by a rumor. He was exposed the moment Tina Turner walked out and never returned, choosing danger over submission, uncertainty over continued harm. And when Stevie Wonder refused to rewrite that moment with excuses or nostalgia, he drew a boundary that many others never had the courage to mark. 5. Sam Cooke, the polished image that hid too much. On the night of December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was not on stage, wrapped in spotlight and applause. He was not at a civil rights rally, leading a crowd with a song that would outlive him. He was not stepping out of a limousine in a tailored suit for photographers. Instead, he was inside a low-budget Los Angeles motel called the Hacienda. By morning, he would be dead shot by the motel manager. The official ruling would read justifiable homicide. The questions would never really close. The shock was not only how Sam Cooke died, it was where he died and who was with him in those final hours. For years, Sam Cooke had seemed untouchable. He was the voice behind a civil rights anthem, a businessman who owned his masters, a black man who carved out power and dignity in an industry designed to deny both. That public image was carefully held up as proof of what was possible. And because it was so valuable, certain stories rarely escaped the shadows. Women who said they knew Cooke described a different version of the man in private, controlling, manipulative, a star who, according to their accounts, used fame to tilt every relationship in his favor. These stories did not dominate headlines. They surfaced quietly, often after his death, and were quickly pushed aside beneath the weight of his legend and the need to preserve a symbol. The motel incident forced those buried tensions into the open. Why was he there? Why was a young woman involved? Why did the narrative shift with each retelling? Witness statements changed, timelines blurred. Instead of demanding clear answers, much of the industry chose a different priority: preservation. Sam Cooke was frozen in memory as a martyr, a perfect silhouette on a mural, a symbol too powerful, too necessary to complicate with uncomfortable details. His story was polished until the sharp edges disappeared. The man became less important than what he represented to Black America, to music, to history. Years later, Stevie Wonder would speak cautiously about this kind of pattern. He did not publicly attack Sam Cooke. He did not try to rewrite his impact on civil rights or soul music. But he did challenge the belief that icons should be placed beyond question, that certain names are too important to examine fully. Stevie had watched how narratives were cleaned up, how contradictions were quietly edited out, how real harm was minimized because the person responsible had done something noble somewhere else. Why does Sam Cooke's story still feel so unsettling? Because he represents a truth people resist: that someone can stand loudly on the side of justice in public while leaving wounds behind in private. That a man can be groundbreaking in business and voice, and still, according to some who were closest to him, damage those with less power. Being on the right side of history in one arena does not automatically cancel behavior in another. And when an industry decides that a symbol matters more than the full truth, it becomes easier to ignore the people whose experiences don't fit the myth. Stevie Wonder understood that tension, the need to honor the music while refusing to pretend the rest of the story never existed. 6. Michael Jackson: when boundaries collapsed and the system closed ranks. On August 24, 1993, Los Angeles woke up to a press conference that shifted the ground beneath the entire entertainment industry. Lawyers stood at microphones. Reporters crowded forward. Words like allegation, investigation, and civil complaint entered the public record in connection with one name: Michael Jackson. For the first time, claims of child sexual abuse involving the most famous pop star on earth were no longer whispers traded backstage. They were headlines. They were live broadcasts. They were impossible to ignore. What followed was not a single, clean moment of truth. It was a slow, detailed demonstration of how power can move when it feels threatened. Inside Michael Jackson's private world at Neverland and beyond, the rules had reportedly been different for years. Children slept at his home. Parents signed documents and agreements. Staff were told where they could not ask questions. Security blurred into chaperoning. Hospitality blurred into overnight access. The line between kindness and disturbing intimacy slowly dissolved until even insiders could no longer say where it should have been drawn. When concerns surfaced inside the camp, they were, according to former employees and legal documents, handled quietly. Transfers instead of confrontations. Non-disclosure agreements instead of open investigations. Discretion instead of transparency. Before the public heard anything, a whole machinery of protection had already been operating in the shadows. As the official investigation gathered speed, something else became visible: not just the allegations, but the reaction to them. Lawyers spoke faster than social workers. Publicists worked harder than child advocates. Settlement numbers were discussed in hushed tones before the full facts had been tested in court. The narrative shifted with remarkable speed from what happened to how much will this cost. In January 1994, a civil settlement was reached with one of the families, reportedly for millions of dollars, without any formal admission of wrongdoing. For many observers, the message felt brutally clear: money could close a chapter without providing resolution. The legal system allowed it. The media moved on. The questions did not. What made this period so disturbing to many was not only the nature of the accusations themselves. It was how efficiently the system seemed to absorb them. The labels stood by. Networks hesitated to cut ties. Celebrities chose carefully scripted language. Fans were encouraged to see Jackson primarily as a victim of extortion, a persecuted genius, rather than a man whose access to children might need to be questioned. The focus drifted away from child safety and toward image repair. Charity performances, emotional statements, and televised declarations of innocence were pushed to the front. Reports about safeguarding, boundaries, and accountability were pushed to the back. This is the moment where Stevie Wonder's response became quietly significant. He did not race to microphones to declare Michael Jackson innocent. He did not join public campaigns insisting that any doubt was an act of betrayal. Instead, he stepped carefully away from the spotlight around Jackson. Collaborations that might have happened never did. Unconditional praise, once common, became rare. To some who watched closely, that restraint spoke louder than a passionate defense ever could. In an industry where loyalty is often expected to be loud, unconditional, and public, Stevie's decision to maintain distance looked deliberate. He refused to join the chorus that claimed genius automatically deserved protection. He did not treat the existence of serious allegations as something to be brushed aside in the name of preserving a legend. Why did that matter? Because it challenged a dangerous idea that extraordinary talent should blur or erase boundaries, that fame somehow rewrites what is acceptable, that questioning a powerful figure is the same as attacking them. Stevie Wonder seemed to understand a hard truth when institutions and individuals rushed to defend a star at all costs. The most vulnerable people in the story are almost always pushed out of frame, and when accountability is replaced by private settlements on media strategies, harm does not necessarily end. It can quietly expand. Other families watch what happens. Other victims, if they exist, see how quickly their pain might be reduced to a payout or a public backlash. The pattern does not dissolve. It deepens. Years later, the same cycle appeared again. New allegations, new documentaries, new witnesses and old testimonies brought back into view. And on the other side, familiar responses: denial, anger, unwavering fan loyalty, accusations that any criticism was a plot. Every new wave of claims did more than revisit the past. It reinforced the original failure, not whether the world could prove guilt or innocence beyond doubt, but whether clear, non-negotiable limits would ever be placed around access to children. That in many ways never truly happened when it mattered most. There was no universal agreement that overnight stays, private visits, and unmonitored time should stop, regardless of who believed what. Instead, the debate became a permanent war over Michael Jackson's name, while the simple principle that no artist should exist above basic safeguards was lost in the noise. Michael Jackson's legacy remains divided. His music is still celebrated, sampled, danced to. His story is still contested in interviews, court documents, in living rooms around the world. But August 24, 1993, stands as a turning point today when boundaries that should have protected the powerless collapsed in full public view, and the world watched to see what the industry would do next. What followed was not clarity. It was denial layered over confusion, layered over loyalty. And denial, when repeated long enough and backed by enough power, becomes something more than a feeling. It becomes its own form of harm. 7. Prince, when control was wrapped in the language of spirituality. The next name on this list unsettles people because there are no flashing blue lights, no mugshots, no dramatic courtroom sketches to anchor the story. It begins instead in quiet hallways, behind locked doors, inside a Minneapolis mansion where the rules were never written down. Yet everyone close to Prince understood them perfectly. Between 2001 and 2004, former partners and close associates would later describe a world in which Prince's authority was absolute, not loud, not obviously brutal, but total. By then, he had woven his personal life, his interpretation of faith, and his career into one sealed system. After embracing Jehovah's Witness beliefs, his inner circle, according to those who were there, began to shrink. Phones were screened. Longtime friends faded from view. New people were ushered in under conditions they did not fully see until much later. Romantic partners described being slowly cut off from family, discouraged from outside work, and expected to follow strict behavioral codes that could change without warning. What you wore, who you spoke to, when you were allowed to leave, all of it, they said, drifted under his control. What made it even more confusing was the language used to defend it. Control was framed as spiritual discipline. Obedience was presented as growth. Doubt was reframed as a sign that you were not ready to evolve. From the outside, everything looked almost serene. There were no 911 calls splashed across news programs, no dramatic public breakdowns, no hotel staff leaking stories to tabloids. Instead, there were quiet testimonies of emotional isolation, silent punishments, and sudden exile from Prince's orbit if someone pushed back too hard. Former partners later described a similar pattern repeating itself. At first, the intensity felt like intimacy, a legendary artist choosing you, focusing his attention, guiding your life. Over time, that same focus began to feel less like love and more like confinement. Prince, they claimed, decided what you wore, who you spent time with, and how you were allowed to express doubts. Questioning him was treated as betrayal. Leaving was treated as spiritual failure. The imbalance of power was nearly complete, and because there were no visible bruises, no public scenes, the damage was easy for outsiders to dismiss as just relationship issues or the price of being close to a genius. Around this same period, observers noticed something else. Stevie Wonder, who had long shown public respect for Prince's brilliance, seemed to pull back. Potential collaborations faded out. Joint appearances did not materialize. Compliments became polite and infrequent. Stevie never launched an attack, never gave an explosive interview about Prince. But those who knew him said his quiet distance was intentional. People close to Stevie have claimed that he was deeply disturbed by any environment where one person's spiritual awakening was used to justify control over others. To him, faith might guide a life, but it should not cage someone else's. Harm does not always announce itself with shouting and broken doors. Power exercised in whispers, through isolation, through shifting rules and emotional pressure, can be just as destructive as power enforced with fists. Former partners spoke about losing their sense of self, their independence, their voice. Leaving that world, they said, meant starting over with no safety net, no financial security, and no clear way to explain what had happened without sounding unbelievable. Prince never faced a formal public reckoning for this side of his life. The account surfaced in fragments, sometimes years later, soft, voiced and careful. But the pattern they describe is consistent enough to leave a question that won't go away. At what point does genius stop being harmless eccentricity and start becoming control? At what point does a private kingdom turn into a cage for everyone inside it? Stevie Wonder seemed to know where that line was, and when he believed it had been crossed, he did what he always did in the face of behavior he could not excuse. He stepped back. Kelly, when predation was protected by silence. The next figure on this list did not hide behind subtlety. On March 22, 2002, in Chicago, a videotape surfaced that showed something the industry had allegedly spent years pretending not to see: exploitation of a minor, so clear that no reasonable explanation could soften it. And yet what followed was not immediate accountability. It was delay. It was denial. It was protection. By the time that tape appeared, rumors about Kelly had already been whispering through studios and tour buses for nearly a decade. People talked about teenage girls waiting in parking lots and hallways, hanging around recording sessions. Young fans were reportedly moved between hotel rooms. Staff were instructed not to ask questions they didn't want answered. Parents were reassured. Money quietly changed hands. The machine was already running at full speed long before the public saw any evidence. The tape did not reveal a brand new horror. It exposed how long so many adults had been willing to look away. The most shocking part was not the existence of physical evidence. It was the reaction once that evidence became impossible to deny. Record labels stood by their investment. Radio stations kept his songs in heavy rotation. Collaborators stayed in the studio. Lawyers working aggressively attacked the credibility of alleged victims. Years passed in a strange limbo. Court dates were delayed. Trials stalled. An eventual acquittal was framed by many as proof of innocence instead of what others saw as a demonstration of how hard silence, fear, and power can work together. For a while, The system appeared to hold not for the vulnerable, but for the star. One absence during this time was noticeable. Stevie Wonder did not attach his name to R. Kelly's projects. He did not appear on stage to defend him. He spoke out instead, criticizing what he viewed as the industry's willingness to shield profitable talent, even when accusations involved young people with far less power. Stevie, according to interviews and reports, did not hedge his discomfort. He did not wait for a perfect legal outcome before deciding that something felt deeply wrong. In a business where no comment often translates to quiet complicity, Stevie chose clarity. Why did it take so long for the abuse to face real consequences after 2002? Because success kept generating leverage. Every hit song became another reason to hesitate. Every chart position bought more time. Every collaborator who stayed silent, every executive who prioritized profit, became part of the architecture that kept R. Kelly insulated. According to survivors and investigators, his actions were not impulsive. They were structured. Grooming was deliberate. Access was planned. Silence was enforced through intimidation, payoffs, and the knowledge that many people had something to lose if the truth fully surfaced. The damage multiplied because, again and again, the industry chose financial gain over meaningful intervention. What makes this case uniquely disturbing is how preventable so much of it appears in hindsight. The warnings were there. Journalists reported. Lawsuits were filed. Families spoke. A videotape circulated. And still for years, very little changed. Tours continued. Albums dropped. Award shows extended invitations. Stevie Wonder seemed to grasp something early that others refused to face. Silence is not neutral. Silence is fuel. Every moment of hesitation, every polite avoidance helped extend the timeline of harm. When predatory behavior is sheltered long enough, it does not simply repeat. It spreads. None. Suge Knight when violence became a business tool. On September 7, 1996, Las Vegas turned into the stage for something people inside the industry had long whispered about and quietly feared. After a Mike Tyson fight, a black BMW rolled down Flamingo Road. Inside were Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur. At a red light, a white Cadillac pulled up alongside. A few seconds of stillness, then gunfire shattered the night. Tupac was hit multiple times. 6 days later, he was gone. For the outside world, it looked like a sudden eruption, a tragic twist in a high-profile feud. But to many who had worked around Death Row Records, that moment did not come out of nowhere. By the mid-1990s, Death Row was more than a record label. It was an atmosphere climate built around intimidation. Contracts, according to insiders, were sometimes signed under pressure. Artists and producers chose their words carefully, even in private. Studio sessions were watched. The building itself was guarded like a fortress. Violence was a stray side effect of the culture. It was woven into the way business was understood. Suge Knight did not just oversee operations. He ruled through presence, through physical threats, through the reputation that walked into the room before he did. Former employees have described meetings where almost nothing needed to be said. The weight of who was standing behind him was enough. Missed deadlines and disagreements weren't simply issues to resolve. They were treated like challenges to authority. In that environment, creativity slid into second place. Survival came first. Artists stopped experimenting and started complying. Because in Suge Knight's world, refusing a demand didn't just risk losing a deal, it could carry real world consequences. The shooting of Tupac crystallized what many already suspected. Fear had quietly replaced music as the organizing principle. A label that once promised artistic freedom had become a symbol of what happens when street politics, ego, and corporate power fuse with no brakes. The industry watched the aftermath in real time, the sirens, the hospital reports, the headlines, and still, excuses poured in. People talked about beef, about East Coast versus West Coast rivalries, about the streets, about cycles of retaliation. Anything that allowed the focus to slide away from leadership and responsibility. In the middle of that noise, one voice cut through. Stevie Wonder began speaking publicly against violence, and hip-hop leadership and the culture surrounding it. He did not always say Suge Knight's name out loud, but the direction of his words was hard to miss. He talked about duty, the responsibility that comes with controlling a company, a roster, a platform. He condemned the idea that ruling by fear was just another style of management. In a genre often pressured and marketed to glorify aggression, Stevie refused to romanticize what he saw as terror masquerading as power. Suge Knight's legacy is not only bound to the night Tupac was shot, it is tied to an era when intimidation was normalized as part of the contract, when artists were treated less like partners and more like property, when fear shaped loyalties, album releases, even the way people walk through a hallway. When a label's agreements are backed not just by lawyers but by the threat of physical harm, damage stops being individual. It becomes structural. The music might top the charts, but underneath, the cost is measured in ruined relationships, shattered trust, and, eventually, spilled blood. Tupac's death was not just a tragic event floating in isolation. For many who watched the rise of death row, it felt like the inevitable outcome of a system built on dominance and menace. So when Stevie Wonder spoke out, he was not attacking a genre or dismissing a culture. He was pushing back against a philosophy, one that confuses terror with leadership, that treats bodies as collateral, and that teaches young artists that success must be purchased with silence in the face of violence. 10. Gil Scott-Heron, when self-destruction turned into collateral damage. The final name on this list hurts in a different way. There are no gunshots in a parking lot, no contracts signed with someone looming over the table, no hotel corridors echoing with screams. Instead, there is a slow erosion of life wearing itself down in front of people who loved him. From roughly 2001 to 2011, New York watched Gil Scott-Heron appear and vanish in cycles. Jail, release, relapse, apologies, promises, then the same pattern again. Friends stopped picking up the phone because they already knew what the conversation would be. Family members pleaded with him to stop touring, to step back, to get help. Collaborators waited, then eventually packed up and walked away. Gil's addiction was not hidden. Interviews, street reports, and court records all pointed in the same direction. The damage it caused wasn't hidden either. Children left waiting. Shows canceled at the last minute. Recording sessions collapsing under the weight of chaos. Entire tours crumbling after one too many disappearances. Each relapse arrived with a familiar explanation: genius under pressure, a sensitive mind in a brutal industry, pain that never fully healed. The same phrases the music world has used for decades to explain away harm when the person responsible is brilliant enough. What made Gil's case different was just how many chances, how many second and third acts he was offered. Loved ones begged him to stop chasing stages and to chase sobriety instead. They asked him to step out of the spotlight before it killed him. According to people close to him, Gil refused. Each return to the mic was framed as redemption. Each collapse was blamed on circumstance, bad luck, the system, anything but his own decisions. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. His self-destruction lost a private spiral in an empty room. It dragged everyone connected to him into instability. Children who relied on him emotionally and financially. Partners who rearranged their lives around his promises. Musicians who invested time, trust, and songs only to watch plans dissolve when he disappeared again. During these years, Stevie Wonder quietly moved away. Once seen as aligned in spirit and message to artists who spoke openly about injustice and the weight of the world, the public overlap between them faded. There were no sharp public comments from Stevie, no angry interviews, just distance. One more file closed in a drawer he chose not to open again. Those close to Stevie said he held a specific belief: suffering might explain a person's pain, but it does not erase their responsibility to the people who depend on them. Compassion has limits. In his view, Gil Scott-Heron was no longer only hurting himself. He was leaving wreckage behind: children, partners, collaborators, people who did not get to choose his path but were forced to live with its consequences. Calling this evil makes many people uneasy, because it doesn't look like intentional cruelty. There is no villain laughing in the shadows. It looks tragic. But when someone repeatedly refuses to change, even after seeing how many others are being pulled under with them, that tragedy starts to tilt into something darker. At some point, self-destruction stops being just inward. It explodes outward. Il Scott-Heron once warned the world in his work about systems that chew people up and spit them out. What he could not do in the end was stop himself from becoming one of those systems for the people closest to him. A storm they could not control but had to survive. Before this documentary closes, there is one name it has held back on purpose. That silence is intentional, because in black music culture, silence is never empty. It is loaded. For decades, Lionel Richie has been framed as the safe one, the polite one, the smile that never cracked while others publicly imploded. While careers burned out in scandal, Lionel appeared to glide above the chaos award shows, television appearances, family-friendly hits, a carefully curated image of success without visible darkness. But here is the uncomfortable question the story leaves you with: is clean always the same as innocent? Insiders have long whispered that Lionel's rise may have come with quiet costs, partnerships that ended suddenly, bandmates who felt they were erased from their own history, business decisions that, according to some who were there, seemed to land profit, credit, and leverage in one direction while others were left standing in the shadows with little voice and no real power. No police reports, no explosive trials, just contracts, closed-door meetings, non-disclosure agreements, and careers that slowed or stalled while this climbed smoothly upward. According to people near Stevie Wonder, he never accused Lionel of physical violence or predatory behavior. That was not the issue. What they noticed instead was the cooling a distance that felt deliberate, collaborations that never came back, public praise that stopped just short of endorsement. In this world, that kind of restraint is rarely accidental. It is often a quiet line being drawn. So the final question lands back in your hands in an industry built on exploitation and image. Is it truly possible to reach the very top without stepping on someone else? And if harm is done silently, legally with smiles and handshake photos, does it count less than the kind that leaves visible bruises? That is the last discomfort of this list. Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it hums softly under perfectly mixed harmonies while the spotlight stays warm and bright. Sometimes it looks like survival. Sometimes it looks like success. Now it's your turn. Which name unsettled you the most? Was it the open violence, the manipulation behind closed doors, the long silence that protected predators, or the one figure you still feel conflicted about, the person you don't want to judge, but also can't fully defend anymore? Scroll down and speak honestly, not with slogans, not with excuses, with the truth you feel after hearing these stories. And if this documentary made you uncomfortable, understand this: that was always the point. These stories were never meant to be easy. They were meant to be remembered clearly without the soft focus that protects reputations at the expense of reality. Subscribe if you want more documentaries that refuse to shield legends when the cost is silencing the people they hurt. Because icons may deserve respect, but the people harmed along the way deserve to be heard. Sometimes the most dangerous story isn't the one everyone repeats. It's the one we were trained never to question. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name and